This presentation was recorded at the Best Practices for Pollinators Summit. For more information, contact pollinatorfriendly.org.
Dynamic, and we are just here to kind of humbly offer some lessons learned, the good and the bad, and hopefully that will help guide you in some of your decision making around restorations. I should also just note that Gina and I work in the Midwest, the Upper Midwest in Minnesota, and so the case studies, the resources, just we're going to have this sort of geographic bias of Minnesota. I will advance slides, right? Try another method for doing that. All right. The obligatory, I am here representing the Xerces Society. We are a nonprofit invertebrate conservation organization. We, the bulk of our work is right on the ground, doing conservation work with landowners, farmers, the community. We do this through a variety of programs. A lot of us focus on pollinators and agricultural biodiversity. We have a number of people who work on endangered species. And that's from monarchs and bumblebees, but even freshwater mussels and different kinds of things without a backbone, right? Invertebrates. We have a really robust, like science-based pesticide protection team that supports all of us so that we can deliver better guidance on pesticides for the people we're working with. And we are also the home for the Bee City and Bee Campus USA programs, which I know there are probably affiliates here even participating today. And we do a whole bunch of cool community science work. And that's just like a really brief snapshot of some of the stuff we do. And I'll just also say that we're a member-based organization, donor-based. Those of you who are in the audience right now who are members, we so appreciate your work. We could not do this work without you. So thank you. Okay, so the place that we are focusing our attention on today is sort of largely categorized as like degraded, abandoned areas. And I'm saying that these are among the most challenging, and I underline that, challenging spaces to work in. But they're also the most inspiring, and I think inspiring for pollinator habitat restoration. I say inspiring partly because like they are ugly and they are dysfunctional and they're not, I mean, we look at these spaces and we think, well, yeah, we could do a lot better. They're sites that are just, not suitable for other production. Maybe somebody tried and then abandoned them. They're sites that are sometimes hard to access. They have poor, soils that make it hard to put them into production for crop purposes. They are, they're usually covered in invasive species, unwanted vegetation. You can find these spaces in, technically, it's a technical term that I'll go over in a minute, old fields that are abandoned like crop fields. These can be old pasture fields. They can just be marginal acres kind of on the sides of spaces that are already in use. Some roadsides look a lot like this. And then there are a lot of areas that are formally in conservation plantings that were primarily meant to just cover the soil, hold on to erodible soil. And so they planted those sites with smooth brome. So like in the Conservation Reserve Program, early years, they did a lot of that. Let's see here. So characteristics of old fields. This is a technical term. These are sites that were formerly cultivated or grazed, but then later were abandoned for one reason or another. The soil quality is usually kind of unsuitable for production for a lot of reasons. It's wet, dry, gravelly, mucky. And then the succession of these sites, so they were initially kind of in use, and then they got abandoned, and then they first get colonized by species with a wide seed dispersal range. Think of like these Canada thistle little seeds with their little like pappus kind of mechanism there that can float around in easily colonize new sites. This could even be native species like goldenrods, but you can think of like dandelions, things that are already ubiquitous in our environment and they can quickly colonize a new site. Eventually they become really dominated by non-native perennial vegetation, things, especially things that are rhizomatous that can really spread out and clone out, do really well in these sites. So they become dominated by these sod-forming grasses. And sometimes this isn't just by accident, sometimes these are actually planted on these sites. And so reed canary grass is a big one in the upper Midwest, quack grass, smooth brome, Kentucky bluegrass. These are some of the big offenders on old field sites that make these really challenging for pollinator habitat restoration. And eventually, if they get abandoned or, abandoned, people aren't caring for them. There isn't natural disturbance like fire, grazing, haying, or, just kind of management. They start to become populated with woody species. These are some of the common ones that show up really quickly in the first 5, 10, 15 years of sort of abandonment. But then eventually it becomes sort of like this dysfunctional woodland. So that's kind of the technical term, or the space that we're talking about today, these really challenging spaces. And then on top of that, there's this other context that surrounds these kind of old field conversions to pollinator habitat, because all of us are feeling this urgency. That's why we're here today, right? This urgency to develop resilient, biodiverse landscapes for pollinator habitat and other wildlife and, ecosystem services and so forth. We also, gratefully, we have a lot of financial resources available to fund projects right now. And, third, there's a increased kind of wariness about using chemical approaches. And so that's an interesting kind of opportunity and challenge, I think, in these spaces that have really tenacious, aggressive weeds. And then there are these additional challenges that just make these sites even more challenging than a flatland restoration, which is that there's difficult terrain. I'm going to say this over and over. These are really aggressive weeds that we're dealing with on these sites. Sometimes when we're trying to implement these projects, they have really tight timelines for implementation, and that could be a real challenge on these sites with really aggressive weeds. And sometimes I think our financial resources outpace kind of the technical support sometimes lags behind on the financial resources that are available. And so we don't have the manpower, the technical help, whether that's contractors or just support staff to help give best management practices for how to do this. And then when we put down seed mixes, they're not strategic, or when we put them down, we don't really see it all get realized. And I think that's problematic too. So those are that's sort of the landscape I wanted to set up for how we're gonna approach the rest of this session. So this is a partner of ours. Her name's Susan Grelling. She has taken on an ambitious brome conversion project. And I'm just using this smiling face as a way to kind of, for all of us to enter into the next phase of this session, which is, how to navigate these challenging projects with best practices and, lessons learned from case studies, which I suppose could kind of be like a subtitle for this whole entire conference. But yeah, I won't tell Susan's story during this session, but maybe in a future session. She's only a couple years in. She's got a very optimistic smile in front of a field of weeds. There are a lot of natives underneath there. I will tell you her hopefully success story later on. But yeah, the first step, this is required homework if you're going to take on pollinator habitat restoration in an old field site, is thorough planning. This is inventorying what's there, not just the habitat elements, the good, the bad that you want to keep and remove, but also understanding your equipment, your knowledge, the people who are going to be involved in this, how much money it's going to take, how much time you want to get this, how the initial investment of time plus the long-term time. I think mapping it out on that local and the kind of landscape scale context really matters too, because these sites were colonized by most of the time invasive species. So if we are once you start that new disturbance regime and add in new seed, you want to make sure that you have a way to mitigate future introductions of invasive species and some of these forces there's a legacy on these sites, and they're gonna want to keep kind of showing that legacy. The grasses are going to want to come back. These invasive species are going to come back in. So thinking about, how it's situated in the landscape, and then making a commitment to ongoing stewardship of these sites. So that's all required homework before you even, get your hands dirty. Well, you might get your hands dirty doing that. But so the first step, basic habitat planning, is figuring out what's there, inventorying the existing resources and the conditions. This can help you be more strategic about, your resources and filling up deficiencies. So the first step, recognize what's there, figure out what's missing. That could be a bloom gap. It could be a host plant for specialist bees that you want to support. It could be a certain kind of functional group, like maybe you don't have enough native cool season grasses and you want to fill that functional group. So figure out what's not there so that you can strategically prioritize improvements. And, I think it's worth pointing out that a lot of these abandoned sites are abandoned because they're not good for crop production. And a lot of that has to do with soils. A lot of that, I think there is a really high potential that on some of these sites, there could be little fragments of prairie vegetation, the remnant vegetation. So just to define terms there, a remnant is, just a tiny little fragment of what used to be like covering our entire landscape. Some of it is a little bit intact. Typically, you find these on spaces where the soil was never plowed or graded or bulldozed, leveled. That's really steep sites often, wet sites, really dry sites. Usually the native vegetation you're seeing there isn't this is sort of a fraught term, but sort of naturally occurring, right? There's a long history of them being there. People didn't just plant them with a seed mix. So some component, it doesn't even have to look really good, like the top photo, where they, that's a bluff prairie in the driftless area of Minnesota, has really high value pollinator plants there. That's just a clear remnant right there. Down below is a picture from Western Minnesota, where it's basically an old, grazing field. Most of what you're seeing in that photo is Kentucky bluegrass, smooth brome. But you can see all those little white yellow flowers out there. It's a plant called death camas or zygodinus. And this is a plant that's sort of toxic to cattle. And so it's a little unusual to see it in something that looks like a grazing land. So I'm thinking no rancher planted that. When I see a field with that kind of flower, I think, well, there's probably some remnant vegetation there. There's a lot of room for improvement on that site, but there's something in the seed bank there. So remnants are really, really important. They are these tiny little islands of biodiversity. They're like little teaching labs for us. They're a reference for how do we, what do we even want to achieve when we're trying to build, prairie pollinator habitat. We can kind of look to a remnant as a reference. These remnants often host really conservative plant species, or rather plant species that are really sensitive to soil disturbance, and sometimes you might equate it with rare. There's rare plants there that are often hosting rare and often specialist invertebrates. And then there's all kinds of like soil interactions that we just don't understand fully. And so it would be a real shame to accidentally till all this up in the name of expedient pollinator habitat reconstructions. So take note of pollinator remnants. You are not pollinator prairie remnants. You might find them. These are just clues in the landscape for how to start to read the landscape. You might see remnants under open grown oaks with those big, wide lateral arms. Sometimes on roadsides. Sometimes you might have to look for indicator plants. Even if it's degraded, you might see things that are like sedges, or if it's in a wet area, Joe Pye weed hanging on. Some conservative plants on dry slopes would be like hoary puccoon. You could find, basically any really steep slope that's south facing or west facing in in Minnesota, upper Midwest, that's a really good candidate space. Sometimes they're covered in cedars. This lower left picture is like that. They removed some cedars and sprang forth a beautiful prairie remnant. This picture on the lower right, is a picture from a severely overgrazed pasture that I was surveying in western Minnesota. It looks like not much food there for pollinators, right? But when I was, surveying this like little inch high grass plant community, I mean, most of them were native grasses. So this is a place where there's probably a lot of potential for seed bank restoration. So those are some places you might expect to find remnants. You can do some virtual sleuthing to figure this out too. For example, you can try to find aerial maps, historical aerial maps. This is a property you can see kind of outlined in red there on the left, where, there's like 20 years in between all these photos. Started in 1950. Minnesota used to be grasslands, This is a site that had almost no trees. 2 decades later, with fire suppression and so forth, in 1974, you start to see some trees creeping in, those dark spots. A couple more decades in 1991 and 2000, you see these sites just filling in with woody species because of fire suppression, no grazing animals on the land anymore, basically no disturbance. So you can kind of get a feel for where you might find these spaces. But then, you've done this, like all this homework, this legwork to figure out, am I looking at a remnant? You still have that decision, whether or not you should like manage it back to prairie, or if it's so degraded that you might need to just still start from scratch. So this is a table that I've attempted to simplify, but it's still complicated. So I'll just walk you through it. There are these factors on the left, and then there's two columns. There's low quality remnants and high quality remnants. So on low quality remnants, you're going to see not very many native species. It's going to be dominated by invasive species. As you can see down lower, abundant invasive species are there. But on high quality remnants, you're going to see a lot of native species and not very many invasive species. And so forth. So you can kind of walk through this decision tree to help you think about, what kind of management actions should I take here? And if you decide maybe the most cautious approach is to just manage first, which I think is wise. If you think you might have remnants, is to just try some management first. Instead of tilling the soil, adding any chemical, doing anything well, some of these are aggressive. But just see if something comes up from the native seed bank. That can be timely haying to remove native seed or invasive species seeds, or remove nutrients from the site. You could daylight a site. You could just add some fire back and see if any, the vegetation responds. Some, prescribed grazing, that kind of thing could really be the first step in getting pollinator habitat back. Xerces has a couple guides to help you through this process. One of them is called Maintaining Diverse Stands of Wildflowers for Pollinators. We have this on the Pollinator Friendly Alliance Summit webpage under this talk link. So you can find a link there. And what I have here as the bullets are really just like chapter titles. And so we have a lot of different tools to help you with strategies, figuring out which strategy for which kind of management goal, and then kind of even data sheets to help you kind of keep track of this process. This could be another talk, so I'm not going to go into too much more detail. Similarly, we have another guide called Interseeding Wildflowers to Diversify Grasslands for Pollinators. And this is also different. This is an enhancement approach where you're bringing some seed in, but you're not starting from scratch. And it can be a kind of complicated set of steps. So there's a lot. These are also this is kind of like the table of contents, the outline for this guide. And it explains when and where to use this approach. There's strategies for if you're primarily dealing with a cool season grass stand or a warm season grass stand or a mixed grass stand. And then there's lists of species that are really good candidates for interceding into these situations. So, and again, this could be another talk, but it's something that you should kind of explore if you're thinking about ways to improve some of these really ugly abandoned old field sites. Okay, so that's all like the enhancement and yeah, enhancement through management kind of stuff. But sometimes your site is so degraded, it's really just invasive species or cool season grasses, and you really know you can do better. So then we're talking about just starting over. This is kind of a start from scratch section to the talk. And that is, we're going to go through these steps for success, starting with the thorough planning, which we already went over, and you might need to restart this process. Once you've come to that decision where you're going to make, you're going to start from scratch, you might have to do a new set of planning to figure out the resources, the timeline, and all of that. The next step is site preparation. So this is that aggressive kind of weed management, trying to do as best you can to eradicate kind of propagules, rhizomes, seeds, thatch on the top of the soil surface so that you can get in with the plant material you want to add. So this third step then is the thoughtful plant selection. And on these sites, I think we need to be even more thoughtful maybe about seed mix design, trying to build really robust, really diverse seed mixes that can kind of continue to be competitive against the legacy of that site, which is that those cool season grasses are going to want to come back. And then, planting methods and post-planting management and stewardship, those are pretty similar to like almost all prairie reconstructions. They don't differ that much for old field spaces, but the ongoing stewardship, that's a big thing. So the rest of this talk, I'm mostly going to focus on these site prep techniques because this is really like the biggest hurdle, I think, on these challenging sites. So one of the things that's going to determine the site prep approach that you take is going to be which species you have, which really problematic species you have on your site. If it's smooth brome, these are a few little like ID tricks on here that I have. So a smooth brome, you can see that little M imprinted on every leaf is there. Quackgrass has these little oracle arms around the stem. Oh, or if you've ever tried to pull quackgrass, you know what it looks like because those rhizomes are crazy. Reed canary grass, one of the key things that I look for even before it's flowering is it's like a fingernail, a little ligule behind. If you pull back the leaf, it's like a really big ligule. Looks like a fingernail. Probably all of you know how to identify Canada thistle, so I won't go into any ID details there. There are some other weeds to look out for too that are really aggressive, worth mentioning here, which is spotted knapweed, wild parsnip, crown vetch. Sometimes even red clover, I think, if there's any reason to believe that there's some hard seed in the seed bank, that can be problematic too. So again, those are just some of the biggest, worst offenders in our region. And knowing what you have there is really going to help you determine which site prep technique might be best for you. These are some of the site prep techniques that we would use in old fields in our area, not prioritized per se by best or worst or even most effective. I have plenty of case studies to share. I don't have time for today, but good and bad kind of results from a lot of these different approaches. So the first one that I'll just highlight here is this conventional farming approach. A lot of agencies, just for efficiency's sake, they will, if they acquire land that they want to turn into wildlife habitat and it's all brome, they will typically just contract that out to a farmer if they can, if it's flat enough, not erodible, they'll put it into corn for 1 year, conventional soy for the next year, and then they'll just plant right into it. And that's one approach. It's so self-explanatory that I'm not even going to say anything more about it during this session, but that's one approach, and it seems to work for some sites. I should also say that there are drawbacks, ecological drawbacks to all of these approaches. So these are all things that you just have to weigh individually on a case-by-case basis. The next approach that is also rather expedient in terms of if you have to flip something on a kind of quick timeline, which is a combination of herbicide and fire, or sometimes you can substitute fire with haying sometimes. There's some organic approaches that we're going to go over too. There's which like I said, we're going to go over those, so I won't even say too much more. Some organizations, particularly the prairie enthusiasts in the upper Midwest, they have really promoted, and it works on a lot of their sites, this method of annual burning and interseeding, but that's a long process, and we'll go over that too. And then tillage is one that at least on these old field sites where you have all these rhizomatous plants that have a lot of any tiny little root fragment usually can sprout a new plant. Tillage is usually not advised on these sites, especially not as a standalone process. Sometimes it can be used in combination with these other processes like herbicide or other kinds of organic processes, but usually when you use tillage, you have to combine it with another suppression technique. So the next part of the talk, I'm just going to go through the first, the three in the center here: the herbicide, organic approaches, and annual burning. Okay, so herbicides and fire, this is sort of like a prescriptive timeline that this is what we might use if you have a brome field that's in a conservation reserve program. This is a federal program, and instead of having it be in order to re-enroll in the program, it's brome. If you need to re-enroll to continue receiving payments, you need to diversify it rather quickly. So in this case, we would try to burn off the site, hay it off, get the thatch removed at the late growing season. Then you would apply herbicide to it when things are regrowing, so when it's still sort of tender and vulnerable. And then the following spring, everything should be kind of like dead. And you want to burn that off again. You're trying to remove thatch and trying to create a seed bank, or not a seed bank, but a place for a seed bed for adding seed. And sometimes this requires a couple of different treatments of herbicide and burning, trying to just really suppress that smooth brome. Usually, there's other grasses in there too, but primarily smooth brome is the target here. And again, probably best to avoid tillage in these situations. It can really create some unknowns. When you till and then plant, you've just created a bunch of question marks that there could be new seeds that come up from that tillage that you weren't expecting, and create all kinds of new management problems later on. So if you till, in this case, I would probably follow with herbicide. There's a couple different organic site prep techniques that I'm going to go over for old field sites. They are from this organic site prep guide that we have at Xerces. Each one of these techniques has its own chapter. There are ideas about when to use it and when not to use it. Some of them are more appropriate for small scale. Some of them can be scaled up. I'm just going to go over two of them that can be scaled up for some of these larger abandoned sites, these old field sites. And the first of those is something we call solarization. And this is using clear plastic to kind of cook the soil. So the first step is to cultivate the site. So tillage comes into play here, cultivating the site, and then burying the edges of a really thick UV stable plastic. Usually this is the kind of thing that you would put on a greenhouse. And then you let that cook kind of all summer long in heat and no shade, ideally. And then in the fall, you would remove that plastic and then just broadcast seed. We've done a lot of trials with this. It can work in the Midwest for sure. But we have found that it can be difficult to really adequately suppress those deeply rhizomatous perennials. So it's something that I would use kind of with caution on an old field site, but it definitely shouldn't be ruled out. It's also something that's kind of hard to do on a large scale, so probably areas that are less than a half acre or so. We have a case study to show here, one that is from Northfield, Minnesota, started in 2014. You can see that there's this slope. It's actually really wet where they receive runoff from a neighbor's drain tile. It was regularly mowed. It had reed canary grass. It had some thistles. They spent a full season with its, smothering or solarizing, I guess you should say. They took that plastic off and then they seeded it actually in the spring. And you can see the soil's like really mucky. So that was 2016. So the next slide, this is 2018, 2 years later. They used a seed mix that was designed for like these types of situations, a detention basin, really aggressive species, and a very high seeding rate, nearly 300 seeds per square foot, which is quite high. A lot of diversity. So like very impressive results. It's beautiful just 2 years in, like wahoo. But this is also, this is a site that I visit every year. It's actually adjacent to my local U-pick blueberry farm, and I visit it and check on this planting every once in a while. And I can see, that they really haven't done a lot of management since then because there's a lot of reed canary grass coming in. Those cattails are still coming back. The Canada thistle is in there. It's still providing a lot of valuable pollinator habitat, but that ongoing management is really needed on these sites. Another technique, organic technique, is smother cropping, and the principle here is to basically put in a crop that will outcompete weeds. And usually this is done for at least one growing season, and you really have to have timing down. I mean, usually this works really well for agricultural operations, especially farmers who are already familiar with these types of crops. So they know how the cues of these plants and when to terminate them. Some of the options for the upper Midwest are, buckwheat, or really the tall grasses, like I'm showing up here on the top is a grass called sorghum Sudan grass. And it creates a ton of biomass and really just shades out everything below. However, the one thing, I'll just go back, this biomass, you have to deal with that somehow before you can put native seed down on your restoration site. So usually that requires mowing it and then burning it or haying it, or sometimes both. Here's a case study of a site that we worked on in southeastern Minnesota. It was a vegetable field they bought the farm, it was all hay fields. Then they started cropping it for vegetables. They realized one field was just way too wet. So they stopped cropping it, and then they put in this sorghum Sudan smother crop for 2 years in a row. Then when we decided to finally plant it, we mowed down the smother crop. Then we had to burn it off. We had to remove that biomass, right, before we could seed. So a fall burn, no more tillage. And then we seeded it. They had 171 seeds per square foot, over, about 40 species. It landed, there's really good seed to soil contact after that burn. But 2 years later, this is a picture from 2 years later. Well, I should just go back. 2019 and 2020, the first 2 years of the restoration, we noticed that mostly what came up was red clover, which was sort of a surprise because that wasn't a part of the existing vegetation beforehand. But it was in the seed bank from when it used to be hayfields. And so that was really dominant, and so dominant that we thought it was kind of threatening to the native species. So we decided to hay off that clover for a few years, leaving, enough height so that native seedlings could still get started. And then in 2022, in year 3, we finally kind of released that vegetation, the native. So you can still see a lot of red clover in there, but there's a lot of native vegetation coming in too. And then last year, I asked them to send me a photo of how things are going. And they sent me this photo, which is just lovely. Like, obviously, they're enjoying their prairie. There's a lot of native flowers there. I mean, nobody takes a picture of a prairie like this if they're not enjoying it. So I thought, I was really like touched, like, great, they're really happy with this. But I also was looking at this picture and thinking, oh, well, there's some cool season non-native orchard grass there. Here's a whole bunch of timothy. Here's some smooth brome. So this photo prompted me to say, all right, let's schedule a prescribed burn in the spring and see if we can push back some of those non-natives that may be threatening some of the native establishment. So ongoing management is the key here. Okay, that third type of site prep technique is one that I described, the prairie enthusiasts, and there are other organizations who do this too, who, they basically recommend, instead of tillage, instead of herbicide, they're basically burning it annually, and they're adding seed diversity like every year. They're adding more and more seed. And I think this can be a really great approach if you have the resources to do that, especially sites where if you have a lot of volunteers who are collecting seed, who could then disperse it. If you might have remnants in the area that you just really want to protect and don't want to do any adverse kind of management actions. There are drawbacks to annual fire. It should be done cautiously when there's refuge around that, can keep some habitat for invertebrates that would perish otherwise in annual fires. So this is an approach that you should consider, though. I'm mentioning down here below, there is a YouTube link on our Pollinator Friendly Alliance webpage site. It can point you to this YouTube video by Rich Henderson in Wisconsin, converting pasture to prairie. And he really gives a lot of detail about this approach and what worked and what hasn't worked, with lots of beautiful pictures of results. So if this is something that seems feasible to you, I would encourage you to go check out that webinar as well. Okay, so the fourth step in success, remember it was like thoughtful planning, site prep. Nope, this is the third step. Thoughtful plant selection. And this is seed mix design principles. So these are principles that belong in all, seed mix design. I've separated them because the lower ones here, I think I've altered a little bit because I think old field situations call for a little bit more strategy. And I'll go through those in a second. So the other reason this is very, very important, almost as important as site prep, maybe equally as so. The reason I'm not devoting a lot of time to it in this particular talk is because I have given a seed mix design talk at a previous summit, and you can find that on the Pollinator Friendly Alliance website. And yeah, go explore all the cool YouTube videos that Lori has on the summit webpage. Okay, so seed mix design principles. The first is to find regionally appropriate native species, right? Make sure you're providing a lot of different species throughout the growing season. There's always at least 5 different species blooming at any given point. Make sure you're selecting species for the right soil conditions, and you're filling those functional groups, like you have some legumes, you have some wildflowers, you have some warm season grasses, cool season grasses, sedges, sometimes even woody species. Adding plant family diversity is something that's a little more nerdy and tricky to figure out, but it can help you host all those specialists that maybe need a special kind of plant. And also it can help, well, there's a lot of reasons, but trying to pay attention to plant family diversity is helpful. And then choose species that you want to support for at-risk taxa, whether that's monarch nectar plants or plants for bumblebees and that kind of thing. And then this next set of principles I've changed a little bit. So in old field situations where you're probably fighting against a really strong non-native cool season grass seed bank, I would have a seed ratio of at least 40 or 50% grasses and sedges, so that you have something that's like pushing against that legacy on the site. Normally, I would say there are certain species and seed mixes that I would be cautious about including at high rates because they can just become dominant, like cup plant or Indian grass or big blue stem. In some cases on these old field sites, you might want to go outside of the recommended boundaries of those because you can use them really strategically to kind of fight problem areas. There's a lot of nuance to all this. It's tricky. Email me if you have questions. I love talking about seed mix design. Aim for higher species diversity, aim for a really heavier seeding rate, and possibly think about the potential for multiple seeding events over time. You might need to think about not just a one and done seed mix, but like a seed mix for year 1, a seed mix for year 4, and so on. Okay, that's seed mix design. I tried to find one slide to point you towards all the different plant selection resources. And the best I could do was to point you towards our Pollinator Conservation Resource Center, where you can click on any of these regions and pull up all of these things that I have listed here. Plant lists, seed suppliers. I have native seed and plant suppliers twice, I guess. Habitat assessment and installation, all these different things you can find there. And there's even lists that Xerces has created that have like staff favorites because of their, their workhorse species. So go there, go find some interesting resources there. Okay, step 4 finally is that the planting methods and timing. So if it's on a larger site, considering a drill or some other mechanical seeding equipment like a broadcast spreader, like it's in that cone shape up there in the top left. Often after you're using a spreader like that, you're cultipacking, like that, rolling over the site to really press seed down onto the soil to make good seed to soil contact. You might use those bigger, mechanical techniques on bigger sites. Or on smaller sites, you can just do some really methodical hand broadcasting and spread it out. And yeah, this is not anything new there's nothing altered here for old field contexts. It's the same for other kinds of prairie reconstruction sites. And then after you seed, expect to do some management. There's sort of early establishment kind of management steps. There's usually some mowing in the first year or 2 to let light down to those little seedlings, take off seed heads of annual non-native plants, and then expect to do that management and monitoring over and over again. Okay, so wrapping that up before I let Gina tell you about her really innovative case studies, is to just remove the weeds aggressively. Don't underestimate these tenacious non-native plants. It's a priority. Make sure you think thoughtfully about the seed mix and how that's going to help you mitigate some of the problem areas on the site. Plant it really well, and then commit to ongoing stewardship of these sites. They were abandoned. That's how they got so ugly. We can care for them, and if we pay attention and do better. Okay, I'm gonna hand it off to Gina and let her wow you with some fun case studies.
There we go. Thanks, Karin. That was really great. Appreciate that. Hello, everyone. I am just so grateful to be here today, and grateful to Karin for inviting me to speak with her, and to Lori, and to all who invested so much in putting this summit together. It's been great. And to everyone who's watching the summit today and this week, for your commitment to pollinator habitat. It's really exciting and gratifying to be part of this group today. So my name is Gina Hugo, and I have the privilege of working for Sherburne County Parks, where I get to prioritize the natural resources within the county's park system. Really believing that the most valuable asset of our nature-based park system is the natural resources. Most of our parkland has been reestablished into native prairie. And most of these native prairies have been converted from conventional agriculture that were in annual row crops, specifically corn and soybeans. And if not, then for prairie restoration, we used conventional site prep methods, including mechanical and chemical. But today I'm going to talk about two projects that really called us up to the plate to employ other methods to convert old fields. And you can go to the next slide. So for a bit of context, we'll just wait till she gets there.
Sorry, I am working on it.
That's okay.
There we go.
Yeah, just to kind of orient you all, Sherburne County is in east central Minnesota, smack dab in the Midwest, and it's almost fully encompassed by the Anoka Sandplain ecoregion, which is characterized by excessively drained, droughty soils, very coarse sand soils, and historically was vegetated by oak savanna and native prairie. You can go to the next slide. And the first project I'll share is at Graham's Park. And this is a 100-acre park with a mix of oak forest, forested wetland, open water wetland, and old hayfield turned prairie. Graham's is our most visited park and our most developed. It actually has a picnic pavilion. Our parks are very nature-based. There's no ball fields. There's no event centers. There's no frisbee golf. Very much about connecting with nature. And at Graham's, we've adopted a no chemical herbicide for trail maintenance policy. And we only use mechanical raking to remove the weeds from our limestone trails in an effort to protect all the people and the pets and the wildlife that visit the park and call the park their home. So on the next slide, you'll see our subject of this project. Oh, you can go back one, Karin. We wanted to hold to the same standard of no chemical for the prairie restoration in the field on the right of your slide. And this field is one that when you look at it, you just think it should be prairie. It's this expanse of 24 acres of rolling topography and a backdrop of oak forest. A native prairie was really the missing piece. Instead, it was a bland, ugly tapestry of introduced cool season grasses, primarily quack and smooth brome, and site challenges, including a desire to avoid chemicals and an inability to cultivate because of the extreme topography and the risk of erosion, and tons of gopher mounds. Very, very rough. This is a tough site. But a few years ago, I had mentioned this field to someone, and they planted a seed in my head about this site sounding like a great candidate for a trample seeding, which is a combination of planting followed by grazing animals so that their hoof action can ensure the seed contacts the soil and has a chance to germinate. And well, that was a pretty cool idea. And I was open to trying anything with the right practitioners and technical experts, and being able to overcome the cost barriers associated with bringing in a lot of grazing animals. So you can go to the next slide. And just when we needed it, help came along, an opportunity through our partners at the Sherburne Soil and Water Conservation District. HELP stands for the Habitat Enhancement Landscape Program, and it's administered through the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources. The partnership quickly grew from between the county and the Soil and Water Conservation District to include the Board of Water and Soil Resources, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Private Lands Program, and the Xerces Society. And you can go to the next slide. And our approach proposed using organic site prep methods, which included prescribed burning, and leaned heavily on conservation grazing with 3 rounds of grazing prior to planting. And next slide. So our first step was to burn at the end of July, which is a very atypical time to burn. It was so hot that day, but our goal was to stimulate young, palatable, nutritious forage at a time when cool season grasses in Minnesota would rather shut down and be dormant. We believed that this would place the highest amount of stress on the stand. And you can go to the next slide. And it worked very well. The forage grew back very quickly. The fire removed all of the thatch. And we were able to deploy our first conservation grazers in the middle of August. So about 4 weeks later, because I believe the burn was July 20th. And we used a combination of sheep and goats, and we saw amazing results. They eat to the black. It was pretty extraordinary. Next slide. Then after a brief rest, the forage regrew, and the team of grazers returned in September, this time with many more sheep than goats, for a second round of grazing. And you can see the stark contrast in vegetation from where they were grazing to where they were going to be moved in the photo on the right. The foreground is where we were about to move them. And then the paddock in the back is where they were currently grazing. So you can go to the next slide. Then the following spring of 2023 is when we planted the native prairie seed, and we followed with another round of grazing actually after we seeded, not having any fear that this would damage the seeding because it was so soon after the seeding that there was no chance that the seed had yet germinated. And then the hoof action could actually help to ensure the seed was pressed into the soil. Now this season in 2024, we will implement mechanical cutting and mowing and add additional species with live plants. And we're adding live plant species that were either not available as seed or are not known to establish well from seed. But we're also including some plant materials that were in the seed mix that we want to strategically place where they can work their competitive muscle, like Karin talked about, in some isolated stands and low areas of reed canary grass. And typically, like Karin said, there's caution against using too many aggressive species in a seed mix. But where non-native competitive vegetation is a challenge, we're going to see if we can capitalize on the aggressive nature of some natives that can really hold their own. And a couple of examples for us include prairie cordgrass and monarda. And the list of species on this slide was put together with the combined experience of the project partners. And you can go to the next slide. So that's the Graham's site. And then the second project I'll talk about is really only just begun. And it's on the county's recently acquired 2 inlets at Bade Hehaka Omash Kusaga Agans Regional Park. And this park landscape is being managed and developed in close consultation with 3 Minnesota tribal nations, and an adopted concept of a nature-based park consistent with the other parks in our system, where we're diligently working to restore and enhance native plant communities. And this is a place that will welcome walking on trails, observing wildlife, and connecting with nature. By the summer of this year, all of the fields outlined in blue north of the lake and the river will have been planted to native prairie and really didn't require site prep because they had been in annual cultivation, corn and soybeans for decades, many decades. So we planted a cover crop of oats last summer, and of course we had a drought, so the oats didn't do much, but we'll be able to plant right into that this spring. So you can go to the next slide. And on this map, you'll see a closer view of our subject of an old field at 2 inlets. It lies just south of the Elk River. It has additional challenges to what we faced in the last project I talked about. Most of this field was in cultivation for many years and was managed in a combination of alfalfa, hay, and row crops. The 20 acres of row crop, approximately covering the north 2/3 of the field, was last cultivated in 2020, and it promptly colonized into persistent cool season perennial grasses, mostly quack. Lucky us. And then less than 10 acres has been managed as alfalfa grass hay, and that's the southern 1/3, the southern kind of points of the field. Gopher activity is also very high here. And additional barriers include access. It's a landlocked piece, and while we do have an easement for access with the adjacent farmer, it just requires that additional logistics of notification and making sure the field roads are dry enough to drive on. So that it's just another layer of communications to add to the project. So you can go to the next slide. And so as an old field that's hard to access, it's already a difficult site and it's really ugly. Karin said that a few times and I thought it was really endearing. But this site has the added complexity of being a traditional cultural landscape. And that's invited us to learn and practice cultural competence by working in close consultation with 3 tribal nations, the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe, the Upper Sioux community, and the Lower Sioux Indian community. The entire landscape is sacred to Dakota and Ojibwe people. The map on the left is an example of an archaeological site map in a non-disclosed location. The black polygons represent the archaeological site. On the right is the same map with an overlay of cultural sensitivity, with the red areas being the most sensitive. And we have this heat mapping done for 2 inlets as well. And I'm sharing this version as an example to illustrate what we're navigating, where soil disturbance and use of chemical both conflict with cultural protocols. So here, more traditional methods of land management that avoid soil disturbance and chemicals are being employed because we want our stewardship of this landscape to honor cultural protocols every step of the way. And you can go to the next slide, which is my final slide. So this is a view of the field looking from the river, and in the foreground is reed canary grass, and that's not part of this project. But further out, you can see the veg line that is primarily the stand-up quackgrass that we're going to be working in. And then south of that, right against the tree line, is the little alfalfa fields. And with this slide, I just want to be clear that these methods are not tried, tested, and true. In fact, I consider us extremely fortunate to be able to try to do better, knowing that our chosen methods may not yield the desired results. With that, I just remain grounded in the belief that land and habitat management is not a one and done. It's a relationship with the land and the vegetation that requires listening and observing. With that comes the responsibility to adjust next steps based on how the plant community responds to a given management step. And so our intended path, I have listed on the screen, but that may change. Our intent is to burn this July and mow in the fall, striving to rejuvenate the alfalfa just enough to get a good hard frost on the new growth, knowing that alfalfa's new growth is sensitive to frost damage, but also trying to stress the quackgrass. And then in 2025, next season, we have a goal of mowing at least 2 times, really to emulate the stress of overgrazing. And we plan to mow in late spring and fall, again, targeting damage to alfalfa, but also stressing the quackgrass. And in 2026, after kind of cleaning it off for 2 years, we'll assess the results to determine the next best steps, with a goal of planting the native species in the spring of 2027. Luckily, the funding associated with this project goes through 2028. So we can push our planting date back to spring of 2028 should we need that additional season of site prep. And we just may. But this is rarely the case. Karin mentioned this. One of the barriers with getting thorough site prep is short timelines for cost share projects or grant funded projects. And so in summary, because I know we're getting there on our time, my portion of the presentation is not so much a how-to like Karen's was, but it's how we have approached and plan to approach old fields. And it's kind of an invitation to all of you to try some methods that work with nature and avoid chemicals that add to the toxic load of our natural world and may cause more harm to pollinators than we actually know. And if you do try things, document your process and your results and share them. Maybe here at the summit, Karin talked about the idea of a lightning round, which I think is brilliant. Doing that will help us all do better. And when we all do better, we all do better. That's a quote, right? I think it was Paul Wellstone. It's a great quote. But yeah, I will wrap up there. Invite Karin to share anything else she thinks would be helpful at this point.
Thank you so much, Gina. And yeah, I mean, I'm going to just reiterate and pause or kind of close this by offering an invitation to share your stories either with us or, and I haven't even talked to Lori about this yet, but I hope that we could do kind of a series of case studies on old field conversions and what worked and what hasn't worked. And these could be, you could think of this as like your favorite mistakes or certain kinds of site prep techniques that have or have not worked, ideally with some results. If you have creative management strategies for remnants or how you've interseeded sites. I think there's so much hunger for this because we're starting to look at these areas of opportunity of degraded, abandoned sites and trying to put more attention on our lands and restore that relationship, but they're challenging sites. So that's going to come with a lot of hiccups and a lot of lessons that would be wise if we could share them with each other. So in the meantime, before that lightning round that might come next year or some other venue, you could check out blogs that have to do with this kind of work at the Prairie Colleges. This is Chris Helzer's blog, from the Nature Conservancy. You can even search brome and try to find some of these conversion stories. The Grassland Restoration Network is also a really great site that has a blog with it's a whole network, obviously, where people share their experiments and their stories. So until our lightning round of favorite mistakes comes to fruition, you can look for stories there. And from there, I think I'm just going to leave you with if I can advance the slides, our contact information.